What does it cost a man to realize he threw away the only person who ever actually held his empire together? Not the crown, not the title, not the army at his back. Her. Luna Vesper Ashcroft spent 7 years building a kingdom with her bare hands, while her Alpha King handed credit to a woman who was busy burning it down. This is a story about what happens when the wrong person finally gets tired of being invisible, and the right man learns that lesson too late. Stay with me all the way to the end. Drop a like if this hits different, and tell me in the comments. What city are you watching from tonight? Let's see how far our pack reaches. The crown was cold. It had always been cold, hammered silver with wolf fang inlays along the base, heavy enough that Vesper had learned to carry her neck differently in the first year she wore it. She'd learned not to flinch when it pressed against her temples during long council sessions, learned not to touch it during negotiations because some of the older alphas from the Eastern Territories read, "That is uncertainty." And uncertainty in a Luna was blood in the water. 7 years. She'd worn it 7 years and she still thought about taking it off every single morning. She didn't think about that this morning. This morning she sat at the edge of the great war table in the northern annex of Blackthorn Keep, the one Ronan never used because the ceiling leaked in winter, and she spread out the correspondence from 3 border pack leaders who were this close to pulling their oath pledges. She could read it in the language between their formal words. The clipped sentences, the missing courtesy titles, the careful way Alpha Drennan of Ironfall had signed his name without the traditional blood seal. That seal meant something. Its absence meant more. She had maybe a week to fix this before it unraveled past fixing. She had been working on it since before dawn. The candles had burned down to half their length by the time Mara, her personal aide, slipped through the door with a tray she set quietly on the corner bench. Mara was 23 and had survived 2 purges of palace staff. She moved like she was always half expecting to be invisible, which made her useful in rooms where being noticed was dangerous. "The council session starts in an hour," Mara said. She didn't ask if Vesper had slept. She already knew. "Send word to Counselor Thane that I'll need 5 minutes with him before the session opens." Vesper didn't look up from the letters. "Not in the corridor, the antechamber off the east gallery. He won't like that." "He doesn't have to like it." She rolled one of the letters and pressed her thumb against the wax seal, testing its age. 2 weeks old. It had been intercepted, held, and then deliberately forwarded late. Someone on the post route was being paid to slow her correspondence. That was new. That was a particular kind of problem because it meant someone was organized enough to think weeks ahead. "I need him where his aide can't report back to whatever room that aide reports back to." Mara picked up the empty cup from beside Vesper's elbow. "There's also—" She paused. Vesper looked up then. Mara's face was the carefully neutral expression she wore when she had something to say that she didn't believe was safe to say. Vesper had learned to read that face the way she read everything else, patiently, without showing that she was reading it at all. "Lady Selene arrived last night," Mara said. "She's in the East Wing. The King's orders. The Chamberlain was told to give her the Thornwall suite." The Thornwall suite was 4 rooms. It had its own receiving parlor and a private access corridor to the upper royal hall. It was not a guest suite. It was a statement. Vesper set down the letter she was holding. She didn't say anything for a moment. She looked at the war table, at the spread of correspondence and maps, and the small notation she'd made in the margin of Drennan's letter. A single line that read, "Trade concession, winter grain, needs to feel respected, not managed." She'd written that at some point in the last hour without even registering she'd done it. 7 years of building someone else's kingdom had gotten so deep into her muscle memory that she was strategizing in her sleep. "Thank you," she said. Mara left. Vesper sat with the quiet for a moment. The ceiling leaked in winter, and it was not winter yet, but there was a dark stain above the north window that had been there for years, and she'd always found it oddly steadying to look at. Something about the fact that the leak kept happening, season after season, and the palace kept functioning around it. She'd asked twice to have the roof repaired. Both times the request had been reprioritized. She thought about the Thornwall suite, the private corridor, then she put it away. Not gone, just filed in the part of her mind where she kept the things she couldn't afford to feel until she had time to feel them, and picked up the letter from Alpha Drennan again. She had work to do. The council session was a performance, like all council sessions, but this one had the particular quality of a performance where several of the actors had privately agreed to change the script and hadn't told the audience. Vesper sat in her place to Ronan's left. The Luna's seat, second chair, the one with the carved armrest that had always sat slightly lower than the king's chair, which was either architectural accident or a very old joke, and she tracked the room. Ronan was in good form. He was almost always in good form at council because performance was one of the few things he was genuinely gifted at. 6'4", dark-haired, with the particular quality of physical authority that came from being an alpha-born who had also worked for it, the kind of man who could silence a room just by being still. Vesper had admired that quality in the beginning. In the beginning, she had thought it was the outward expression of something that went deep. She'd learned to be more careful about what she admired. The matter of the Ironfall trade agreement, said Councillor Thane, who was 58 and had survived 3 successions and wore that survival-like armor, has been tabled for the 3rd session in sequence. I want to note for the record that the Ironfall Alpha has sent a secondary inquiry about the delay. Drennan worries too much, Ronan said. He had his hand flat on the table, easy posture, the picture of unbothered authority. Ironfall needs us more than we need Ironfall. Let him worry. Vesper watched 2 of the junior counselors exchange a look. Just a flicker, gone in an instant. The secondary inquiry used the phrase, reconsidering the terms of the alliance, Thane said. He was careful with it, neutral-voiced, presenting information the way a man presents information when he suspects it will be badly received and wants the record to show he did present it. Drennan's always been dramatic. Ronan leaned back. We'll address it after the southern boundary matter. Vesper. He said her name the way he said it at council now. Efficient, a little clipped, the tone of a man directing a capable but interchangeable resource. What's the status on the Grey March Pack petition? He hadn't looked at her once since the session opened. Resolved, she said. Pending your formal signature. Alpha Cain agreed to the modified grazing rights in exchange for the eastern road access, which costs us nothing since we weren't using that corridor. His son does well enough at the border post that keeping Cain cooperative is worth more than the road. Good. He made a note. He didn't ask how she'd managed it or when she'd communicated with Cain, because he didn't need to know those things. He just needed the resolution. That was the nature of their arrangement now. She'd spent months not naming it, letting herself believe it was temporary, that Ronan was under pressure, that the pressure made him harder, that the hardness was not personal. She'd been good at that kind of belief. She'd had a lot of practice. After the session, she caught Thane in the antechamber off the East Gallery, as she'd arranged. He was a compact man with tired eyes who had been around long enough that very little surprised him, and he looked at her with the particular expression of someone who had already guessed the shape of the conversation. Drennan's correspondence is being intercepted, she said. No preamble. She'd learned Thane preferred it that way. Delayed by 2 weeks on the route through the Keswick relay post, which means either the relay postmaster is being paid or the person being paid has enough access to redirect at a higher level. Thane was quiet for a moment. That's a serious accusation. It's an observation. I'm not accusing anyone. I'm telling you because if Drennan pulls his pledge, the first fracture hits the Northern Alliance structure, and then we're having a very different conversation about Ironfall and every pack that watches Ironfall for signals. Does the king know? The question landed flat between them. They both understood what it carried. I'm telling you, Vesper said. Thane looked at the wall for a moment. Then he looked at her. There are people in this palace who have access to the relay routing, not many, perhaps a dozen who would know which correspondence to delay without triggering an audit flag. He paused. Some of those people are recently elevated. Recently elevated. It was a very precise kind of language. I appreciate the observation, Vesper said. She left him there. She found Ronan in the upper hall that afternoon, which was not where he was supposed to be. He was supposed to be in the war room reviewing the border patrol schedules, which she'd been told was the afternoon's agenda. The upper hall was where he went when he wanted to be seen rather than when he had work to do. He He was talking to Celine Duskmore. Vesper had known Celine for 2 years. She'd been careful about it, careful in the way she was careful about many things, which was to say, she had never said aloud what she actually thought. Celine was the youngest daughter of a northern noble house that had been climbing for 3 generations, the kind of family that produced beautiful, educated women and pointed them precisely. She had pale hair and a way of listening with her full attention that made people feel selected. She was very good at making people feel selected. She was standing close to Ronan, not touching, but arranged in the particular way of someone who had calculated the distance between not touching and implying that touching was an available option. Ronan was laughing at something she'd said. Vesper had not heard him laugh in 7 months. She knew this because she had noticed the absence. She had noticed the absence the way you notice water draining, incrementally, and then all at once. She didn't stop walking. She passed through the hall on the far corridor, heading toward the administration wing, and she didn't look back. Behind her, she heard Celine's voice. Low, warm, the kind of voice that always sounded like it was telling you something private. Your Luna seems occupied. And Ronan's voice, easy, unbothered. She usually is. Vesper kept walking. Her pace didn't change. She reached the corner and turned it and stood for a moment in the narrower corridor beyond, her hand flat against the stone wall, and she breathed, once, twice, and filed that away in the same place she'd filed the Thornwall suite this morning. The filing cabinet in her chest was getting full. The reception that evening was for the trade delegates from the southern coast, which meant 3 hours of food she wouldn't eat and conversation she would have to manage alone because Ronan had pulled her aside an hour before they were due to enter and told her, with the flat efficiency of a man changing a meeting room, that he would be attending with Lady Celine as his formal escort for the evening. The delegates from Port March know Celine's family, he said. It'll ease the initial contact. She looked at him. I've been managing the Port March relationship for 18 months. And you've done good work with it. Pause. This is just easier. Just easier. She turned that phrase over in her mind. I'm your Luna, Ronan, and you'll be at the reception. He was already adjusting his coat, looking at the mirror rather than at her. I'm not asking you to stay home. I'm telling you the arrangement for the evening. She stood very still. She had a gift for standing still. Years of council rooms had given it to her. The Port March delegates will notice, she said. Alphas from the coastal houses watch for signals. Bringing Celine in your formal escort position tells them something. It tells them that Celine's family has value in this court. He turned from the mirror. Which is accurate. He looked at her then. And the look was not unkind exactly. It was the look of a man who has been telling himself a particular story long enough that the story has become the truth. He was looking at her as if she was being unexpectedly difficult about a small administrative matter. Ronan. She said his name the way she used to say it, and watched something flicker across his face. Not regret exactly, but recognition, the way you recognize a sound from a long time ago. Think about what you're doing. He looked away first. Don't make this complicated, he said. She didn't say anything else. She attended the reception. She wore a dark green gown and the Luna crown, and she worked the room with the quiet precision of someone who had spent 7 years learning exactly how to read a political gathering and move through it without appearing to work. She spoke with the Port March head delegate, a thick-set man named Aldrich, who had a permanent squint and remembered everything, and she eased 3 specific tensions she had identified from advance correspondence and confirmed 2 trade route arrangements that Ronan hadn't even known were in question. She did this while watching Ronan escort Celine from one cluster of guests to another, making introductions, laughing, easy and warm, in a way he had stopped being with her so gradually that she had never identified the moment it changed. Aldrich, who had been around long enough to miss nothing, said quietly beside her, "Your husband is a fortunate man." She turned a smile toward him that gave nothing away. Port March's wine exports increased 14% this cycle. That's the fortunate part. He smiled, a real smile, surprised out of him. You know the numbers. I know all the numbers, she said. She didn't sleep. She lay in the suite that had once been theirs and was now hers. Ronan had taken to the adjoining quarters months ago, proximity without intimacy, a private, unspoken migration. And she looked at the ceiling and she let herself think. This was the discipline of it, the part no one saw. In the councils and the corridors, she kept everything managed, and at night she allowed herself to actually look at what was in front of her, because the only thing worse than the truth was the truth you hadn't prepared for. The truth was this: she had been diminishing for years, 1 degree at a time, and she had been so committed to the work of keeping the kingdom functional that she had told herself the diminishing was temporary, a phase, something that would correct when the pressure eased, when Ronan found his footing again, when whatever this was ran its course. She had been lying to herself, not in the dramatic way of someone in denial, in the quiet way of someone who had decided that the work was more important than the wound, which was true in the moment, and was also the mechanism by which you could hollow yourself out entirely without anyone noticing, including you. The Thornwall suite, the escort arrangement, she usually is. The intercepted correspondence and whoever had authorized that interception and what they were actually building, which was not what it looked like, because Selene Duskmore's family had a long history of building things that didn't look like what they were. She lay in the dark and she thought about the moment in the corridor after the reception, when she had passed Ronan and Selene at the foot of the stairs, and Selene had touched Ronan's arm, light, brief, proprietorial, and Ronan had not moved away. She thought about what she had done for 7 years, what she had carried quietly, without credit, because the work was what mattered, and she had believed in the work even when she had stopped fully believing in the man. She thought about what the kingdom would look like without her, specifically, pack by pack, alliance by alliance, the delicate web of relationships she had built and maintained, the favors called in, the slights absorbed, the long game she was playing in correspondence threads that spanned years. Ronan didn't know about most of it. He knew outcomes. He didn't know infrastructure. She thought about the council meeting, Thane's careful language, recently elevated. She thought about who would be elevated next and what would be done with that elevation and what the kingdom would look like in 18 months if the current trajectory held. She thought about Alpha Drennan, whose correspondence was being delayed, who was already pulling back, who would read every signal he could find from this court and read them accurately. She thought about the crown on the dressing table across the room. Silver with wolf fang inlays. Cold in winter, cold in summer, cold at the exact moment when she had needed to feel like it meant something. She thought about the fact that she was lying in the dark at 3 in the morning in a palace that was held together in significant part by systems she had built, married to a man who had just escorted another woman into a formal diplomatic reception in her place, and she was spending her sleepless hours figuring out how to fix his alliance problems. And something very quiet happened in her chest. Not rage, not grief. Those would have been easier. It was the specific feeling of a load-bearing wall realizing it was the only thing holding up the structure, and asking itself, quietly, for the very first time, what would happen if it simply stopped? She made her decision over the course of 11 days. She did not make it quickly, because quick decisions were for people who hadn't thought through the full weight of what they were choosing. She made it the way she made all her serious decisions, which was to test it from every angle and look at what came back. During those 11 days, she completed everything she had started. The Drennan correspondence. She sent a personal writer, bypassing the relay post entirely, and she met with Drennan's representative privately and reached an agreement that would hold the Ironfall alliance for another 2 years, regardless of what happened in the capital. She wrote 3 sets of instructions addressed to Thane, detailed and coded in the system she'd developed with him in the first year, covering the scenarios she could predict. She thought very hard about the scenarios she couldn't predict. There were more of those. She did not confront Ronan. She had learned long before this that confrontation with a man who was not ready to hear something was an expenditure of energy that changed nothing except the shape of his resistance, and she no longer had enough of herself left to spend it on that. On the 8th day, she sat across from him at dinner, one of the 2 or 3 private dinners they still shared in any given month, a formality now more than anything else, and he talked about the southern trade expansion and the new garrison proposal, and she listened and responded and asked the right questions, and at some point he looked at her with a flash of something she recognized from years ago. "You're quiet tonight," he said. "I'm always quiet," she said. He looked at her a moment longer. Then he looked away. She wondered in a small, distant part of herself if there was anything that could have been said in that moment that would have changed the trajectory. Some precise combination of words. She turned it over briefly and set it aside, because she had tried many precise combinations over many months, and she had learned that you cannot pull a man back to a version of himself he had decided to leave behind. On the 11th day, she rose before dawn as she always did. She dressed. She did her hair back the way she wore it for working, not for appearances. She went to the desk in the corner of the suite, and she wrote 2 letters, one to Thane, one to the administrator of the 3 smallest outer villages in the territory. Villages that had been requesting aid for 2 seasons and receiving nothing. The letters were practical and specific. They did not explain anything. They didn't need to. Then she picked up the Luna crown from the dressing table. She had thought about this moment a great deal over 11 days, whether it would feel like something, like relief or grief or the specific devastating quality of walking out of somewhere you'd spent years building. It felt like setting down something very heavy that she had been carrying so long she'd forgotten it wasn't part of her body. She placed it in the center of the table where it would be clearly visible, not hidden, not dramatic. The crown in the center of the table and nothing else, no letter, no explanation, because any explanation she could write would be inadequate to 7 years of what had actually happened, and she was done using her words to manage someone else's understanding. She put on a plain traveling coat. She had a single bag packed 3 days ago, nothing inside it that identified her rank. She walked through the palace in the hour before the servants were fully awake, through corridors she had memorized because she had always known, in some preserved animal part of her, that you should know all the exits. She passed the old northern annex with the leaking ceiling. She passed the antechamber off the east gallery. She passed the corridor where she had stood with her hand against the stone wall, breathing. She did not pass the Thornwall suite. She reached the small outer gate on the west wall, the one used for supply deliveries, and the young guard there, 18 at most, new to this post, looked at her with the uncertain expression of someone who recognized her face but couldn't place it in this context. She looked at him steadily. "Open it," she said. He opened it. The road beyond the wall was pale gray in the pre-dawn light. She walked out onto it and did not look back, because she had learned a long time ago that looking back at the moment of a decision was a way of unmade decisions you had already committed to, and she was done unmake things on other people's behalf. She walked. It was nearly an hour later when the palace was fully awake, and the chamberlain had been called, and Mara had been found, and the empty suite had been searched, and the crown had been found on the table. Cold silver in the early morning light, wolf-fang inlays, the mark of a woman who had decided she was done carrying what they had never thought to value, that someone finally thought to check the outer gate. And what they found there, scratched into the stone of the gatehouse wall at eye level in Vesper's precise handwriting, not a letter, not a speech, just 10 words, made Thane go very still for a long time. "You will understand what you had when you understand what you've lost." Ronan was not told immediately. By the time he was told, one of the 3 Eastern Alphas had already sent an urgent rider with a message that contained, in its formal diplomatic language, the first hairline crack in the architecture Vesper had spent 7 years building. It would not be the last. 3 days later, and 200 miles northeast, a woman who wore no crown sat across a rough-hewn table from 7 village elders in the territory of Ashenvale, and something in the way she listened, still, attentive, without agenda, made an old alpha named Cora set down her cup and say, "We've been asking for someone like you for a long time." Vesper looked around the table at the worn faces, the careful hope in them, the specific quality of people who had learned not to expect much from power. "I'm not here to lead you," she said. "What are you here for, then?" She thought about the crown on the table in the palace she had left. Cold silver. Wolf-fang inlays. The weight of something that had never actually fit. "I'm here to work," she said. She picked up the documents they had spread before her. Land records, dispute filings, a water rights conflict that had been running for 6 years, and she started reading. In the palace 200 miles southwest, A king who had not yet begun to understand the dimension of what he had lost was standing in an empty suite, holding a crown, trying to identify the exact moment he had made the mistake that brought him here. He would spend a long time looking for that moment. He would eventually understand that it was not a moment. It was 1,000 small choices, each one unremarkable on its own, and the accumulation of them had built something he had only now turned around to see. And what he saw, in the space where his kingdom's foundation had been, was an absence shaped exactly like a woman who had finally decided he was not worth staying for. And the absence was beginning to speak. The first thing to go was the grain route through Keswick Pass. Vesper had known it would be the first thing. She had known it the way you know a bruise is coming before the impact fully registers. The body reads the trajectory before the mind catches up. The Keswick Agreement had been built on a personal relationship she'd spent 14 months cultivating with the pass warden's wife, a sharp-tongued woman named Ida, who had no patience for official channels, but considerable loyalty to people who showed up when she asked them to. Vesper had shown up twice, ridden out in weather that made the palace guard nervous, sat in a low-ceilinged hall and eaten whatever was on the table, and listened to Ida talk about what the pass actually needed versus what the capital kept offering. That agreement did not survive Vesper's absence by 10 days. She wasn't there to receive the news directly. She was in Ashenvale's Eastern District, standing in a half-collapsed grain barn with 3 village elders and a structural problem that had been reported to the capital 8 months ago and never answered, when a rider from Thane reached her. Not an official rider, a personal one, a young man named Corvin, who had been Thane's eyes on the eastern roads for 2 years and knew how to travel without leaving a record. He handed her a folded page. She read it standing in the barn, with afternoon light coming through the gaps in the roof and the smell of old grain and rot around her. And when she finished, she folded it again and put it in her coat. "How bad?" she said. Not a question. Corvin had been on the road for 3 days, and he looked it. Warden Ida sent word to 3 other pass holders. The message was specific. "The Luna arrangement is void." Her words. "The Luna arrangement," she said it back flatly. "Yes, ma'am." One of the elders, a heavy-set man named Brooke, who had been watching her with the particular attention of someone who was recalibrating his estimate, said, "Trouble from the capital?" "Trouble from the capital is my former concern," Vesper said. She turned back to the barn's support beam, the one that had shifted on its foundation and was now bearing weight it wasn't designed to carry. "Here's what I need to know about this beam." Brooke watched her for a moment, then he answered. She spent the rest of the afternoon on the barn. That night, after the elders had gone, she sat with Corvin by the fire in the small house she'd been given. A single room, rough walls, a window that let in the wind, and she let herself think through the cascade. Keswick Pass was primary. Without it, the eastern grain shipments slowed, which meant 3 northern packs that ran lean on winter stores were going to start looking for alternative arrangements by the first frost. Those packs were part of the Northern Alliance chain, which was the chain that Alpha Drennan anchored. She had patched Drennan for another 2 years, but 2 years assumed the surrounding structure held. Without Keswick, the surrounding structure did not hold. "What's Thane doing?" she said. Corvin shook his head. "Trying. The council's fractured. 3 of the senior members are pulling in different directions, and the king—" He stopped. She looked at him. "Say it." "The king is focused on the Celine Duskmore situation. Her family sent 2 representatives to the capital 4 days ago. There's talk about a formal elevation." The fire popped. Outside, the wind moved through Ashenvale's broken streets. This place that had been half abandoned for 6 years because the capital hadn't answered its requests, and was now beginning, slowly and effortfully, to come back to something. "A formal elevation," she said. "Lady Celine to court advisor. Possibly higher." Corvin looked at his hands. "There are people in the palace who are saying the Luna position may be formally declared vacant within the month, for administrative purposes." She had known this was a possible shape of things. She had known it the way you know structural collapse is possible when you've been watching the foundation. You don't need the moment of falling to understand the trajectory. It still landed with a particular weight in her chest, in that place where she kept the things she'd been filing away. She breathed through it, 1 breath, 2. "Go back to Thane," she said. Tell him the Drennan arrangement holds without me. Tell him the specific language I used in the rider. Drennan's representative will confirm. That's worth something, even if no one in the capital currently understands what it's worth. Corvin nodded. He looked at her carefully. Is there anything else you want him to know? She looked at the fire. Tell him I'm working. Dukabt. 3 weeks into the kingdom's unraveling, Ronan rode to Ashenvale. She knew he was coming before he arrived because Cora, who had the specific alertness of a woman who had survived by paying attention, came to find her in the eastern fields where she was working with the irrigation dispute and said, with characteristic directness, "There are 6 riders on the northern road, palace colors." Vesper straightened up from the map she'd been crouched over. She looked at the road. Then she looked at her hands, which were dirty from 3 hours of field work, and she did not clean them. He came with fewer attendants than she would have expected. Just 2 guards, 2 aides, and a man she recognized as his personal tracker. No council members, no formal delegation. That told her something. He was here outside official channels, which meant he didn't want a record. She met him in the square at the center of the village. She didn't go out to the road. She waited. Ronan dismounted. He had been riding hard. She could see it in the set of his jaw, in the way he moved, tight, controlled, the particular tension of a man who had been angry for some distance and had wrestled it down to something he could walk with. He looked at Ashenvale, at the repairs in progress on the eastern buildings, at the people working. Then he looked at her. The last time she had seen him, she had been in a traveling coat with a single bag, walking through a gate. She was wearing different clothes now, but she had not changed anything else. His eyes went to her hands, the dirt on them. "You've been busy," he said. "Yes." He looked around the square again. A woman hung washing across an upper balcony. 2 men were building a frame for what would become a covered market. Children crossed at the far end of the street. All of it had the slightly precarious quality of something new, something that had not had time to become permanent yet. "This is what you chose," he said. "I chose to go where I was useful," she said. That's all it was. His jaw tightened. "You left without a word." "I left without a fight." She held his gaze. "That was the kindness. You wouldn't have recognized it as one, so I didn't explain it." The 2 guards had stayed by the horses. The aides were far enough back to be out of easy hearing. This was as private as a conversation could be in an open square, which meant whatever he said here was going to be said without cover. Vesper. He said her name the way he'd said it in the corridor that night, reaching for something. "The Keswick route is gone. Drennan is—" "I know what Drennan is doing," she said. "I've been tracking it." That stopped him. He looked at her. "From here." "I have contacts," she said. "I've always had contacts. That wasn't something you paid close attention to." The words landed. She watched them land. He absorbed them without flinching, which told her he'd been sitting with some version of this realization on the ride over and had arrived partially prepared. "Come back," he said. It came out more direct than she thought he'd intended. Not a request wrapped in strategy, just the bare ask. "The Northern alliances are fracturing. The trade agreements you built are fracturing because the conditions I built them on no longer exist," she said. "Those agreements were relational. They were built on trust in me specifically. You can't transfer them. You can't copy them. They're not a document you can hand to someone else to execute. Then come back and execute them yourself." She looked at him for a long moment. He was still physically what he had always been, large, certain, the kind of man whose presence filled a space. She had loved that quality in him. She had spent years interpreting it as depth when it was something more complicated than that. "Ronan," she said, "what exactly are you asking me to come back to?" The question sat between them. He opened his mouth, then he closed it. "The kingdom needs—" "What does Ronan Blackthorn need?" she said. "Not the kingdom. You." He looked away. That was her answer. "I need things fixed," he said finally. His voice had the flat quality of honesty that has come out shaped wrong. "I need the Keswick route restored. I need Drennan managed. You need a diplomat," she said. "Not a wife, not a partner, a resource." She kept her voice even. "Not cold." She didn't have the distance for cold, not standing 6 feet from him in a square where she could see the specific quality of the light hitting his face. That's what I became. Gradually, and then completely. And I don't say it to wound you. I say it because I want you to understand why I'm not going back. He looked at her then, directly, and for a moment she saw something she recognized. The man before the kingdom had done to him whatever the kingdom had done, the one she'd married believing in. It was still in there somewhere. That was the hardest part. Not that he had become unrecognizable. That he hadn't. Celine, he started. I don't want to talk about Celine, she said. That's not what this is about. The elevation is administrative, he said, and she watched him say it with the expression of someone who half believed it. Her family's influence is useful during the restructuring. It's not… Ronan, she said it quietly. Stop. He stopped. I know what Celine Duskmore's family has been building for 3 years, she said. I have watched it from the inside and I have tried, quietly and through the only channels available to me, to show you what I was watching. You were not ready to see it. That's done now. She breathed once. What happens in the capital going forward is your problem. I hope you see clearly before the cost gets too high. I genuinely mean that. He stared at her. Something moved through his expression. Not rage, but something adjacent to it. The kind of feeling that lives right next to rage because it has nowhere else to go. You're just… He stopped himself, started again. After everything we built. After everything I built, she said. The correction came out level, without heat, which you will understand more completely in about 3 months when you see how much of the load-bearing infrastructure was invisible to you. He absorbed that. She watched him absorb it. And you won't help, he said. I am helping, she said. Here. These people asked for it 8 months ago and the capital never answered. I answered. She held his gaze. That's not nothing, Ronan. That's actually what it looks like when someone is where they're supposed to be. The square was quiet around them. Somewhere behind him, one of his aides coughed. Ronan looked at Ashenvale again. The repairs, the people, the slow visible work of something that had been given up on being rebuilt. He looked at it with the expression of a man who was doing a kind of calculation he hadn't done before, assigning weight to things he hadn't been weighing. You're not coming back, he said. No, she said. He nodded once. The kind of nod that is not agreement but is the acknowledgement of something final. He turned back toward his horse. He stopped with his back to her. His shoulders were rigid. If it falls apart, he said, without turning. The Northern alliances, the whole structure, that's on me. Yes, she said. It is. He mounted. He rode out with his 2 guards and his 2 aides and his tracker back the way he'd come, and she watched him go, and she did not follow him with her eyes past the point where the road bent north and took him out of sight. She stood in the square for a moment after. Cora appeared at her elbow with the specific quiet of a woman who had been nearby throughout and had the good sense not to insert herself. Well, Cora said. Well, Vesper said. He didn't take it well. He took it better than I expected. She turned back toward the eastern district. Come on, we haven't finished the irrigation mapping. They walked. Vesper's stride was the same as it always was. Measured, purposeful, the walk of someone who knew where she was going. Inside her chest, in the filing cabinet that was gradually being replaced by something else, something with more air in it, she acknowledged the weight of what had just been closed. It was not nothing. It was one of those necessary severances that does not stop hurting just because it is the right thing. But there was work ahead of her, and she was, for the first time in a very long time, working for herself. That had a particular quality she was still learning to name. 8. The message arrived from the capital 17 days later. It came through official channels this time, stamped and sealed, delivered by a palace courier who had the expression of someone carrying something he did not want to be associated with. It was brief. 3 sentences. The Luna position had been formally declared vacant pending restructuring of the court administrative roles. Lady Celine Duskmore had been elevated to senior court advisor with authority over external alliance management. The former Luna's personal effects would be held in the palace archives pending her formal acknowledgement of the arrangement. Vesper read it once. She set it on the table. Cora, who had read it over her shoulder without apology, said, That's a declaration. It is, Vesper said. He let her write that. He let her shape it, Vesper said. Whether he read it carefully enough to understand what she was actually saying in it is a different question. She looked at the 3 sentences again. Alliance management. That was the specific language, not ceremonial, operational authority over the exact infrastructure that Vesper had built. She's moving faster than I estimated. That was the thing she had underestimated. Not Selena's ambition, which she had read correctly, but her pace. The elevation to senior advisor should have taken a season at minimum to push through the council. 3 weeks meant Selene had people already placed in the council structure, which meant the interceptions of the Eastern correspondence had not been preliminary. They had been part of something that was already complete. Vesper's chest went very still. She had thought she was watching the opening moves. She had been watching the endgame. She looked at Cora. Cora's expression was the particular look of a woman who has lived a long time and seen how quickly good situations can turn. How many of the Northern Alphas have you personally dealt with? Vesper said. Not a question. 3, Cora said, in my time as elder representative. Would they meet with you? If I asked them directly, most likely. Pause. Why? Vesper looked out the window at Ashenvale. The rebuilding, the repairs, the early signs of something that had not yet become what it could become. She thought about the document on the table. She thought about Selene Duskmore sitting in the rooms of the senior court advisor with operational authority over every alliance structure that Vesper had spent 7 years building. Using them. For what exactly? She thought about 3 sentences and what they were designed to accomplish beyond what they said on the surface. Because someone just handed a woman with a 16-year family agenda the keys to the entire Northern Alliance system, she said. And the man who handed them to her doesn't know what that system actually does. Cora was quiet for a moment. And you think it matters to you even now? Vesper turned from the window. Not for him, she said. Not anymore. But there are 40,000 wolves in the Northern Territories whose pack agreements run through that structure, and none of them had a say in what just happened. She picked up the document and folded it with precise, deliberate movements. So yes, it matters. She put the document in her coat. Outside, Ashenvale continued its slow, visible work of becoming something again. Inside her, in the place where she'd spent years filing things away, something had shifted. Not back toward the palace. Not toward Ronan. Toward something that didn't have a name yet but had weight and direction and the particular quality of a decision that, once made, cannot be walked back. The point she had thought she'd already crossed turned out to be further ahead. She was about to cross it now. The meetings with the Northern Alphas took 11 days to arrange and 3 days to conduct, and by the end of the 3rd day, Vesper understood that the situation was worse than she had estimated, which was saying something because she had not estimated it lightly. Cora's contacts held. 3 Alphas agreed to meet in a neutral location, a trade hall in the border town of Brackenvale, unremarkable enough that no one from the capital's intelligence network would flag the gathering as significant. Vesper arrived before all of them, walked the hall's perimeter twice, noted the exits, and sat with her back to the wall. Alpha Drennan came last. He was a lean, weathered man of 50 who had been running Ironfall for 22 years, and he sat across from her with the expression of someone who had already made a decision and was attending this meeting as a courtesy. "I'll say what I came to say," he said. He didn't waste time on preamble. She had always appreciated that about him. The Duskmore woman sent a representative to Ironfall 6 days ago. Vesper kept her face still. What did the representative offer? A revised trade structure, better rates than anything the capital has offered in 3 years. He looked at her. She had numbers that should not have been possible to have. Specific numbers. Our current agreement terms, the internal cost assessments, the leverage points. He paused. The kind of numbers you only get from palace documentation. Vesper's hands were flat on the table. She did not move them. She's been in the archives, she said. She's been in whatever she wanted to be in, Drennan said. The question I have for you is whether the king knows what's being offered in his name. No, Vesper said. He doesn't. Drennan absorbed that. Then he's either complicit or he's blind. He's neither, she said. He's a man who trusted the wrong person and has not yet paid the full cost of that trust. He'll pay it. She looked at Drennan directly. What did you tell the representative? I told her I needed time to consider. He leaned forward slightly. I'm here because of what we built, you and I. That 2-year arrangement you sent through your personal rider. I know what that cost you in terms of positioning yourself outside official channels. I'm not ungrateful. His jaw tightened. But I have 4,800 wolves in Ironfall who need those grain routes to function regardless of what's happening in the capital's court politics. I cannot hold a loyalty position indefinitely, on principle. I'm not asking you to hold it indefinitely, Vesper said. I'm asking you to hold it long enough for what Selene Duskmore is actually doing to become visible. And how long is that? She looked at him. I don't know yet. The silence between them had weight. Drennan looked at Cora, who was sitting slightly behind Vesper's right shoulder. He looked back at Vesper. You have no title, he said. You have no palace backing. You have no formal standing to be sitting across this table from me. No, she agreed. And yet, here you are. Here I am. He studied her for a long moment. The particular quality of his attention was the thing that had always distinguished him from the alphas who performed authority. He actually looked at what was in front of him without the filter of what he expected to see. 2 weeks, he said finally. I'll hold Ironfall's position for 2 weeks. After that, I have to answer to my pack. 2 weeks, she said. Thank you. The other 2 alphas were less generous. One gave her 10 days. One gave her a week and the frank assessment that if she could not produce something concrete in that time, the smart move for his pack was to take Selene's offer and sort out the political implications later. She thanked him too. She thanked everyone, and she meant it, because they were doing the only thing people in their position could reasonably do, which was protect their own people in the conditions they actually faced rather than the conditions they wished existed. She rode back to Ashenvale with Cora in the kind of silence that is not empty, but full, packed with the running calculations of a mind working against a deadline. 2 weeks isn't enough, Cora said at some point. I know, Vesper said. What do you need? I need to know what she's actually building. The revised trade offers, the archive access, the speed of the elevation. Those are not separate moves. They're phases. She stared at the road ahead. She's replacing the infrastructure, not destroying it. Replacing it with dependencies that run through her family rather than through the crown. Cora was quiet. That's not court politics. No, Vesper said. It's not. The document arrived on the 9th day. It came through Corvin, who had clearly ridden through the night and arrived in Ashenvale with his horse lathered and his face set in the particular way of someone carrying something they didn't want to be carrying. He handed it to Vesper without preamble. It was a copied document, not an original, a transcription in Thane's handwriting, the careful block lettering he used when he wanted something to be read precisely. She read it standing in the doorway of the house she'd been given, with the morning light coming in flat and gray. It was a correspondence record. Selene Duskmore to 3 separate individuals over a period of 14 months. The names of the recipients were titles rather than names. Eastern Holding, Duskmore Secondary Branch, the Vaymark Intermediary. The content was operational, timelines, asset transfers, and in one section, a passage that Thane had underlined twice in his transcription. When the king's position becomes sufficiently unstable, the transition to the new administrative framework can proceed. The Northern Alliance structure, once under our management, provides the border leverage necessary to ensure the hostile pacts understand their incursion will be unopposed by the Crown during the window. She read it twice. She looked up at Corvin. Where did Thane get this? From the courier records in the Eastern Relay Post. He swallowed. The same post where your correspondence was being held. Thane's man found a second set of records that had been hidden inside the routing logs. Someone had been keeping copies of everything that moved through that post, including the outgoing. Vesper turned and walked back inside. She set the document on the table. She stood there for a moment. Outside, she could hear Ashenvale working. The sounds of the market frame being finished, someone calling across the square, a child running. The ordinary sounds of a place that was slowly becoming habitable again. The hostile packs understand their incursion will be unopposed during the window. She thought about the phrase with the cold clarity of someone who had just had a large thing click into place. She thought about the Eastern packs that had been making incursion probes along the border for the last 6 months. Probes that the capital's intelligence had categorized as opportunistic, the usual border testing that happened when a kingdom signaled instability. Not opportunistic, coordinated. The hostile packs were not reading weakness and responding to it. They had been told a window would open. They had been told when. They were waiting for the timeline to advance, and the timeline was Celine Duskmore's Northern Alliance transfer schedule, which meant the window opened the moment the transfer was complete and the alliance structure was redirected away from the Crown's actual defense architecture. 40,000 wolves in the Northern Territories. The Ironfall Pack. Drennan's 4,800. All of them dependent on an infrastructure that was being systematically hollowed from the inside. Vesper picked up the document. She looked at it until she had every line of it fixed in her memory. Then she looked at Corvin. "I need to go to the capital," she said. Corvin's expression did not change, which meant he had expected this and had already decided not to argue. "When?" "Now," she said. Done. She arrived in the capital in the early morning of the second day. She did not go to the palace. She went to Thane. He was waiting in the same antechamber off the East Gallery that she had used for private conversations when she lived here, which told her that Thane operated on the assumption that some locations were simply better than others, and you kept using them regardless of the circumstances. He looked older than when she had left, but old in the specific way of a man who had been carrying more weight than usual rather than simply aging. He looked at her when she came in. He did not express surprise. "You saw the document," he said. "I saw it." She sat across from him. "How much does Ronan know?" Thane folded his hands on the table. "He knows the Eastern incursions have intensified. He knows the Northern alliances are unstable. He does not." He paused. "He has not connected the two things. Has anyone tried to connect them for him?" "I tried," Thane said. 3 days ago. I was told that I was viewing the situation through an outdated framework and that the court advisor's analysis—" He stopped himself. "I was not heard." The specific way he said it, flat, careful, stripped of anything that could be called complaint, told her everything about the past weeks in this palace. "Is there anyone on council who hasn't been managed?" she said. Thane considered. 2, possibly 3, depending on the day. "I need a meeting with Ronan," she said. "Not a request, not through channels. A meeting, today, in a room that Celine Duskmore's people cannot monitor." Thane looked at her for a long time. "He may not receive you." "He'll receive me," she said. "He has a temper, and he has pride, but he still functions on pattern recognition. I'll make sure he knows what I have before he decides whether to receive me. And if he's too far gone into this to hear it even then," she breathed out once, "then I take what I know to Drennan directly, and we build the defense outside the palace's authority entirely, which will cost Ronan his kingdom, but will save the wolves in it." Thane was very still. "You would do that?" "I would do what needs doing," she said. "I always have." He looked at her with an expression she hadn't seen on his face before, something between recognition and grief, the look of a man understanding a thing too late to have done it differently. "I'll get you the meeting," he said. Bosom. The meeting happened in the war room, the real war room, the one in the lower keep that had been built 3 generations back, with walls thick enough to make distance monitoring difficult and a single door that Thane positioned himself outside. Ronan was already there when she entered. He was standing at the far end of the room with his arms crossed, and the expression on his face when she walked in was complicated. She watched him work through several things at once. Anger at her reappearance, something beneath the anger that was not entirely anger, and the particular tightness of a man who had been told something important was coming and had steeled himself without knowing for what. She set the transcription on the war table. She pushed it toward him without speaking. He looked at her, then he looked at it. He picked it up and read it, and she watched his face while he did, because she needed to see where the document landed in him and how deep it went. He read the underlined passage. He read it again. "Where did this come from?" he said. "The Eastern Relay Post. The same post that was intercepting my correspondence." She kept her voice level. "Thane's man found the copies." Ronan set the document down. He was very still in the way that large, physically powerful men are still when they are dealing with something that has genuinely shocked them. All that force held in check by the discipline of not knowing yet which direction to put it. "This is—" He stopped. "It's what it is," she said. "She has been building this for at minimum 14 months, possibly longer. The elevation, the archive access, the trade offers to the Northern Alphas. Those were phases. The end state is the alliance structure under her family's control during an Eastern invasion that her correspondence has described as a coordinated window." The muscle in his jaw worked. "She's been in my palace," he said. "She's been in your palace," Vesper said. "In your archives, in your council, in your alliance structure, with your authority." He picked up the document again. She watched him read the underlined section a third time. She watched the moment it stopped being information he was processing and became something he felt. The visceral understanding of having been genuinely used, not outmaneuvered in a fair contest of political intelligence. Used, specifically, deliberately, as the instrument of his own kingdom's dismantling. "She told me—" He stopped. He looked at the wall. Vesper did not say anything. There was nothing to say in that space. A man coming to terms with the specific shape of his own mistake needed to arrive there himself, or he never really arrived. "She said your contacts in the Northern Territories were working against the Crown," he said. His voice had gone flat. "She said the instability in the alliances was coming from your interference after you left, that you were pulling the threads deliberately." Vesper looked at him. "And you believed that?" He didn't answer. He didn't need to. "Ronan." She said his name with effort, because she was tired of this, tired in the deep bone way of someone who had been carrying someone else's failures for too long. "I left because I was done. I was not done enough to destroy what I built. Those are two different things." "I know that now," he said. "Do you understand what's in that document?" "I understand it." "Then you understand that Drennan has 10 days before he takes Celine's offer, that the Eastern Pack leaders have been waiting for a specific window to open, that the window is your Northern Alliance structure, and it is currently in the process of being handed to the people who arranged for it to be handed to them." He looked at her. His eyes were very dark, and the expression in them was something she had not seen there in years. Not the easy confidence of a man who had always won, but the raw look of a man who was standing in the wreckage of something he had built and had just understood how it fell. "What do I do?" he said. The question was not rhetorical. It was not the question of a king who expected answers to be managed for him. It was the stripped-down ask of a man who had run out of the resources he usually relied on and was standing in front of the one person he should not have needed to ask. She looked at him for a long moment, at the war room around them, at the document on the table between them. "You arrest her," Vesper said. "Tonight, before the next courier leaves the capital. And then you call Drennan yourself and you tell him what you found, in plain language, and you accept that it will cost you his respect and his comfortable view of your competence, and that is the appropriate cost of what you allowed to happen." He absorbed that. "And you." She looked at the map on the wall behind him. The borders. The Eastern Territories where pack leaders were waiting for a signal that had been arranged without their knowledge by a woman in a palace they had never been inside. She thought about 40,000 wolves. She thought about what happened when the window opened and the defense infrastructure had been quietly redirected. She thought about who she was, underneath the 7 years of managing a kingdom that had stopped acknowledging she existed. "I will help you stop the invasion," she said, "because those are not your wolves or my wolves. They are wolves, and they did not choose any of this." She held his gaze. "After that," she said, "we're done. Completely and finally done. I will not be your Luna again. I will not be your resource again. I will not be in this palace again." He looked at her. His throat moved. "Vesper, say you understand," she said. "That's all. Say you understand the terms." A long pause. Outside the thick walls of the war room, the capital went about its business. Somewhere in the East Wing, in the Thornwall suite with its private corridor, Celine Duskmore was almost certainly writing the next phase of a plan that was now running out of time. "I understand," Ronan said. It did not sound like a victory. It sounded like what it was, a man accepting the cost of being exactly who he had been, and finding that the cost was higher than he had imagined any individual choice could accumulate to. Vesper picked up the document from the table. "Then call Thane in," she said. "We have tonight to do this right, and then we have whatever is left before the Eastern Pact stop waiting." She walked to the door. What was coming? The arrest, the confrontation, the invasion, was not a war she had chosen, or a crown she wanted. It was the remaining obligation of a woman who had walked away from everything except her own conscience, and her conscience had always been the most inconvenient thing about her. She opened the door. Celine Duskmore did not go quietly. Vesper had not expected her to. A woman who had spent 14 months building a structural conspiracy inside a functioning kingdom, intercepting correspondence, placing people in relay posts, arranging coordinated invasion timelines with Eastern Pact leaders, was not a woman who collapsed when the door opened. She was a woman who had prepared for the door opening and had decided what she would do when it did. What she did was talk. Thane brought 4 palace guards and came in through the Thornwall Suite's main entrance at the second hour past midnight. Vesper stood in the corridor outside and listened through the wall to the muffled sequence of it, the guard's announcement, the brief silence, and then Celine's voice, clear and unhurried as river water, saying something that made the guard commander hesitate long enough that Thane had to repeat the order. When they brought her out, she was dressed, fully, precisely. Hair arranged, composed as if she had been awake and prepared. She looked at the corridor and she looked at Vesper, and her expression did not change by much, but the slight recalibration behind her eyes was visible if you knew how to look for it. "I thought you'd left," Celine said. "I came back," Vesper said. "For him." She said it with a particular evenness that was not quite contempt and not quite curiosity. "For the 40,000 wolves who didn't have a say in your timeline," Vesper said. Celine looked at her for a moment. Something moved in her face. Not guilt, which Vesper had not expected to find there, but something more complicated. The expression of a strategist recalculating a variable that had not performed according to prediction. "You're more inconvenient than I estimated," Celine said. "I've been told," Vesper said. The guards moved her down the corridor. Vesper watched her go and then turned back to the war room where Ronan was waiting and the work was just beginning because an arrest was not a solution. An arrest was a moved piece and the board was still fully in play. Ronan called Drennan before dawn. Vesper sat in the corner of the war room and listened to him do it, and she watched the quality of his attention, how he held the document in his hand while he spoke, how he did not hedge, how he said the specific words, "I was deceived and I am telling you directly," without softening them or routing them through diplomatic language. It was the hardest kind of thing for a man like Ronan to say, and he said it without flinching, and she thought, despite everything, despite the months and the weight of what had been done and left undone, that there was something genuine in him that had not been entirely buried. It did not change what she had said to him in this room, but it was a thing she noticed. Drennan listened. There was a long pause on his end before he responded. "How many days until the Eastern Pacts move?" Drennan said. Ronan looked at Vesper. She held up 3 fingers. 3 days, Ronan said. "Possibly less." Another pause. "Send me the documentation, the transcription from your man Thane. I want it in my hands before I make any commitment." "It's already writing," Ronan said. "I sent a courier an hour ago." A shorter pause this time. "All right," Drennan said. "Ironfall holds. We'll talk again when I have the documents." The line, a relay system carried by positioned wolves along the Ironfall route, went silent. Ronan set down the communication piece. He looked at the map. 3 days, he said. "That's an outside estimate," Vesper said. Celine's courier was scheduled to leave this morning with the final confirmation to the Eastern Pact leaders. "We stopped that courier, but they may have a secondary trigger if the confirmation doesn't arrive on schedule." A secondary trigger. A person who is positioned to read the absence of communication as confirmation enough to move. She looked at the map. Or they may wait. Depends on how careful they were. How careful were they? She looked at him. Very. The war room felt close. Two of Thane's staff were positioned at the far table, working through Celine's archived correspondence that had been pulled from the East Wing after the arrest. 14 months of carefully worded documents that, read in sequence, assembled into a blueprint so thorough it was almost architectural. Ronan stood at the map. He was not the relaxed man she had watched perform authority in council sessions. He was something else, stripped down to the functional reality of a situation that had no good options, only less bad ones, and operating with the tight-focused quality of a wolf that had finally, at significant cost, figured out which direction the actual threat was coming from. She thought about what it took to get a person to this place, the specific kind of loss that cuts past performance and pride and lands in the place where actual judgment lives. She had seen it happen in pack councils, in village elders, and people who needed to lose something real before they could see clearly. The loss was never wasted, but the cost was always too high. I need the garrison commanders from the northern 3 posts, she said. Tonight. Can you get them here by morning? If I ride hard orders through the relay. Ride them, she said. He did. Barakum. The garrison commanders arrived in stages throughout the morning. 3 weathered men who had been running border posts long enough that the circles under their eyes were permanent features. Vesper laid out the situation for them with the same economy she used for everything. What the Eastern Pack leaders had been told, what they were waiting for, what the absence of Celan's courier might mean for their timeline. Commander Aldous, the eldest of the 3, a man with a broken nose that had healed crooked and 24 years of border service, looked at her across the table for a moment after she finished. You're not the Luna anymore, he said. Not hostile, factual. No, she said, but you're running this. I'm advising, she said. The king commands. Aldous looked at Ronan. Ronan looked back at him with the specific steadiness of a man who had decided to stop performing authority and simply exercise it. She advises, Ronan said. You listen. Aldous looked back at Vesper. He nodded once, the nod of a man filing a thing away and moving on. The eastern ridge has 3 natural choke points. If they're moving in formation, they'll use the central one, widest approach, best cover. We've been watching it for 6 months. Show me, Vesper said. He showed her. She spent 2 hours with the garrison commanders over the maps, and she asked questions the way she always asked questions. Specific, sequential, building from what was known toward what was probable. Where the Eastern Pack leaders had been positioning, what the supply lines looked like, how long they could sustain a push before logistics became a problem. By midday, she had a picture she could work with. By midday, she also had a message from Ashenvale, carried by a rider who had pushed through the night. The message was from Cora, and it said, in Cora's characteristically unadorned language, Eastern movement on the Brackenvale Road. Not scouts, numbers. They were not waiting for the secondary trigger. They were already moving. Patient. The next 36 hours had a quality she had not experienced in years. The compressed, airless intensity of a situation where every decision had immediate consequence and there was no space between the thinking and the doing. Ronan sent the garrison commanders back with orders. He rode himself to the Ironfall border to meet Drennan directly, which was the right call. Drennan would hold firmer with a face-to-face commitment from the king than with any number of relayed communications, and Vesper had told Ronan this, and he had gone without arguing about it. That was new. That was something. She did not go with him. She stayed in the capital, and she coordinated, because coordination was the thing the next 36 hours required more than anything else. The translation of intelligence into positioning, the sequencing of garrison responses, the management of the Northern Pack leaders who were now receiving rapid-fire updates through Thane's relay network and needed those updates to be accurate and consistent, or the fragile renewed trust would shatter. She did not sleep. She ate when Mara put things in front of her, which Mara did with the quiet persistence of someone who had decided that this was her specific job, and she was going to do it regardless of anyone's official title status. At the 14th hour, she was sitting in the war room with 3 maps spread across the table and a piece of cold flatbread in her hand, reading a relay report from Commander Aldous at the Eastern Ridge, when Thane came in. He looked at the maps. He looked at her. He sat down across from her and he said, "Celine's people in the council. We've identified 4. She looked up. Confirmed or suspected? 2 confirmed. 2 strong suspected. He set a list on the table. The confirmed ones have been managing information flow to the Eastern Pack leaders through a private relay that runs through the Duskmoor secondary estate. We cut it 2 hours ago." "Good," she said. "The suspected ones. I need authority to hold them pending confirmation." He paused. "That authority would normally come from the Luna." They looked at each other. "It comes from the king," she said. "Put it through Ronan's standing emergency order from last night. He authorized holds on any person confirmed or strongly suspected of coordinating external military movement against the Crown. Read it broadly." Thane's mouth moved towards something that was not quite a smile. "You drafted that authorization." "I did," she said. "Put it through." He put it through. At the 22nd hour, the first reports from the Eastern Ridge arrived. The approaching formation was larger than Aldous had initially read. Not a probe, not a testing movement, a push. 3 pack groups moving in coordinated sequence using the central choke point exactly as Aldous had predicted, with a flanking movement on the southern approach that was either very good tactical planning or they had inside information about the ridge's secondary monitoring gaps. Vesper looked at the flanking movement report and thought, inside information. She thought about the 4 council members. She thought about 14 months of systematic architecture, and she felt, not panic, which she had never been particularly good at, but the cold functional awareness of a situation that was worse by one specific degree than she had estimated. She sent a rider to Aldous with 3 lines of instruction about the southern approach. She sent another to the secondary garrison at Greymarch with repositioning orders. She sent a third to Ronan, still at the Ironfall meeting, with a single line, "Come back now." Then she stood at the war room window, and she looked out at the Capitol, and she thought about the weight of what she was doing, not the strategy. She had been doing strategy her entire adult life, and strategy in the abstract was clean. She thought about the specific human reality of it. Aldous' men at the Eastern Ridge, who had signed up for border patrol and were now looking at a coordinated push from 3 pack groups. The Northern Village Wolves, who had come back to Ashenvale because she had shown up and started fixing things, and who were now in territory that could become contested. The 40,000 in the Northern Alliance territories, whose entire winter grain structure depended on the Keswick route that had just been restored 2 days ago and could be severed again in a single aggressive move. People operated on the infrastructure you built for them, and they never saw the infrastructure while it was working. They only felt it when it broke. She had spent 7 years building it. She had watched it start to break when she left. She was here now, not because she had been called back or because she owed anyone anything, but because the infrastructure was people, and people were not expendable in service of the point she was making to a man who had taken her for granted. That was the line she had been holding on to through all of it. The difference between walking away from a bad situation and abandoning a responsibility. She had walked away. She had not abandoned. And when the responsibility required her to come back, she had come back. On her own terms, for her own reasons, which were not about Ronan. They had never been about Ronan. They had always been about this. The unglamorous, exhausting, invisible work of keeping the framework standing so that people who had no idea what the framework was could live inside it without fear. She turned back to the maps. And Chaz, Ronan arrived back in the capital at the 28th hour, with Drennan riding at his side. She had not expected Drennan. She looked at the 2 of them coming into the war room with dust on their coats and the grim synchronized energy of men who had made a decision together and were here to carry it through, and she recalibrated. "He rode with me," Ronan said. "I can see that," she said. Drennan looked at the maps on the table. He looked at the positioning markers, the relay reports, the Aldous dispatches. He was quiet for a moment, with the quality of someone reading a room's full information load before speaking. "Your southern approach read," he said. "The flanking movement. That's Kyle Voss. He commands the Greymarch Eastern Unit. He's done that move before, on the Ironfall border 3 years ago." She looked at him. "You know Voss?" "I know his tactics. Drennan moved to the map. If Voss is on the southern approach, he's not flanking for position. He's flanking for the garrison relay post at the Grey March Junction. He wants to cut your communication line between the eastern ridge and the capital. The Grey March Junction. She had sent the repositioning order to the secondary garrison there 2 hours ago. If Voss reached the junction before the garrison repositioned, how fast does Voss move? She said. Fast enough, Drennan said. You need someone at the junction who doesn't need a relay order to make a decision. She looked at Ronan. He was already looking at her. I'll go, he said. She had a single moment of something that was not quite the feeling she had spent 7 years suppressing, not the warmth of partnership or the reflex of the woman who had stood beside him for all those years. Something more stripped down than that. The recognition of a man who had finally understood what the job actually was and was prepared to do it at personal cost. Take Aldis's second unit, she said. They know the southern terrain. Don't try to stop Voss at the junction. You won't have the numbers. Hold him there. Buy the garrison repositioning time. How much time? She looked at the map, at the distances, at the relay timing. 3 hours, she said. Maybe less. He nodded. He picked up his coat. He stopped at the door. He looked at her. Not the look of a man who was about to say something, just a look, straight and clear and carrying the full weight of what the last months had cost both of them, what the last 7 years had built and broken and left behind. She held it for a moment. Then she looked back at the maps. He left. Pads. The next 3 hours were the longest she had spent in years, and she had spent some long ones. The reports came in pieces. Aldis holding the central choke point, taking pressure from the main push. The Grey March garrison repositioning slower than she needed. And then, at the 2-hour mark, a relay from the southern approach that was not from Ronan's unit, but from a scout positioned at the ridge overlooking the junction road. The scout's message was 4 words. Junction held. King down. She was on her feet before the message finished being read to her. Thane caught her arm. Not forcefully, just the pressure of a man who needed a single second of her attention before she moved. Down doesn't mean dead, he said. I know what it means, she said. She looked at the relay runner. What else? That's all the scouts sent. The relay's still... A second runner came through the door. He handed Thane a second message. Thane read it. His face did something complicated. He handed it to Vesper. She read it. Junction holds, King wounded, mobile, Voss unit broken. Southern approach stalled. Reinforcement needed at central choke point. Aldis is being pushed back. She breathed. Ronan was upright. The junction held, Voss was broken. But Aldis was losing ground at the central choke point, which meant the main push was advancing, which meant in the next hour they either reinforced the central position or the eastern pack leaders breached the ridgeline and reached the first northern villages. She looked at Drennan. He was already reading the message over her shoulder. He looked at her with the expression of a man who had been calculating the same math. Ironfall has 200 in the capital staging area, he said. I brought them when I rode with the king. I was waiting to see where they were needed. Central choke point, she said. Now. I'll lead them myself, he said. She looked at him. Drennan, I know my wolves better than any runner you can send, he said, and Aldis needs to see an allied alpha on that line, or the morale math gets complicated. He paused. You know I'm right. She did know that. She hated that she knew it, because it meant committing Drennan personally to a line that was under pressure, and if the line broke. But the line would break without him. That was the calculation. That was always the calculation. Not the option you wanted, just the one that held. Go, she said. He went. The war room was down to Thane, 2 aides, and Vesper, and the maps on the table, and the relay system that was feeding her information in fragments. She stood at the central map, and she moved the markers as the reports came in, and she thought about nothing except the logic of the positions. Where the pressure was, where the gaps were, where the next report would come from, and what it would say. This was the thing that war actually was, she had learned years ago. Not the moments of collision and decision, which lasted seconds. The hours on either side of those seconds, where you could not control what was happening and could only position well enough that when the seconds came, The people in them had what they needed. She had positioned as well as she could. Now she waited, which was the hardest part of any campaign she had ever touched, and she had touched more than her title had ever acknowledged. The relay from Aldous came at the 2.5-hour mark. She read it, and she went very still. Drennan's Ironfall wolves had reached the central choke point, and the line was holding. But the Eastern Pack main force had not, as she had predicted, concentrated at the choke point. They had split. A secondary force, she had missed a secondary force, had moved northwest along the ridge while the central pressure held Aldous' attention. Northwest, toward the capital's outer wall, toward the ungarrisoned section of the outer wall that she had noted 3 days ago when she first arrived and had added to the list of things to address after the immediate crisis was managed. She looked at Thane. He had read it too. His face was very still. "How many in the secondary force?" she said. "The scout estimate is 80 to 100, Thane said. The outer wall's ungarrisoned section ran for approximately 300 yards. A force of 80 to 100 wolves moving fast would reach it in." She turned to the window. The capital was going about its morning in the streets below. Ordinary morning sounds, people moving, the noise of a city that did not yet know what was coming northwest along the ridge toward its undefended wall. She looked at Thane. "What do we have inside the capital walls?" she said. "Right now. Not relayable, not at the ridge. Here." Thane thought. "Palace Guard. 40. Maybe 45. He paused. "And whatever the two of us can carry." 40 palace guards against 80 to 100 wolves moving at push pace toward an ungarrisoned wall. She thought about the seconds that were coming, about positioning, about what she had available and what the gap was between available and needed. She thought about 7 years of building a kingdom for a man who hadn't seen her, about 11 months of walking away from it, about 40,000 wolves who had not chosen any of this, and whose safety ran through decisions made in rooms they would never enter. She picked up her coat. "Gather the palace guard," she said. "All of them. I'll meet you at the northwest gate in 10 minutes. Thane looked at her. "You're going to the wall. Someone has to hold it until Ronan's unit can redirect from the junction." She pulled on the coat. "The king is wounded but mobile. If we can hold the wall for 40 minutes. "If," Thane said. "If," she agreed. She looked at him directly. "Get the guard. 10 minutes. She walked out of the war room and down the corridor, and she did not let herself think about the odds, because odds were a thing you thought about before you decided, and she had decided, and thinking about odds now was just a way of frightening yourself for no useful purpose. What she thought about instead was Ashenvale, the grain barn with the collapsed beam, the market frame going up in the square, Cora saying, "We've been asking for someone like you for a long time," the specific quality of work that was actually yours, work you chose, for people who asked for it, in a place where the asking and the answering were both genuine. She was going to go back there when this was done. She was going to go back and finish the irrigation mapping and settle the water rights dispute and watch the covered market go up, and none of it was going to be visible to anyone who was keeping score of which figures shaped which kingdoms. But first she was going to hold a wall with 40 palace guards against a force 3 times their number, in a capital city that did not yet know it needed holding, for a man she was no longer in love with, for people who did not know her name. She reached the northwest gate. The guards were assembling. See? Young men mostly, palace-trained, better at ceremony than combat, looking at her with the specific expression of people who had not expected their morning to go this direction. She looked at them. 43. She counted 43. "Listen to me," she said. Her voice carried the way it always carried when she needed it to. Not loud, just clear. "There is a secondary force moving toward the ungarrisoned section of the northwest wall. They will reach it in approximately 30 minutes. Our job is to hold that section until reinforcement arrives from the junction." One of the younger guards, 18, 19 at most, with the wide-eyed look of someone who had signed up for gate duty and was now somewhere else entirely, said, "How many are coming?" She looked at him. She thought about lying, and she thought about what lies cost people when the truth arrived anyway. "More than us," she said, "but we're holding a wall, not fighting in open ground. That matters. Position matters more than numbers when you have the structure." She believed that. She had built things on that belief for years. She was about to find out if the wall agreed with her. "Northwest section," she said. "Move." They moved. She moved with them, and above the outer wall the sky was the pale gray of early morning, and somewhere northwest along the ridge a force of 80 to 100 wolves was running at pace toward the one gap in the capital's defenses. And everything that came next, the holding or the breaking, the 40 minutes or the failure of them, was going to happen in the next span of time with whatever was available and no more. This was what the work actually looked like, not the councils and the correspondence and the quiet management of a kingdom's invisible systems. This. 43 guards and a woman with no title standing between a gap in a wall and the consequences of every choice that had led here. She reached the wall. She looked out through the northwest embrasure at the ridge road below, pale and empty in the morning light. And then, at the far edge of vision, where the ridge road curved around the tree line and came into sight, movement, fast, coming straight for them. The force came out of the tree line fast and low, 80-some wolves moving with the particular coordinated silence of people who had trained for this specific kind of push. Not a charge, not a brawl, but a tactical breach. They knew where the gap was. They had been told exactly where the gap was, which meant Celine's information had been more complete than even Vesper had estimated, and there was a cold clarity in recognizing that in the same moment as the ground began to shake with their approach. Vesper looked at her 43. "Wall," she said. "Tight. Don't let them find the edges of you." They tightened. She moved to the center of the line because that was where the weight would hit first, and she needed to be where she could read the pressure as it came, not managing from a safe position that would tell her nothing until it was too late. The first wave reached the wall base, and the noise changed, the tactical silence breaking into the hard physical reality of bodies meeting resistance, of wolves who had expected a gap finding people standing in it instead. The palace guards held because they were in a defensible position, and because Vesper had put them there correctly, staggered, braced, using the wall's geometry the way you used every structural advantage you had when you were outnumbered. And the math only worked if you made the terrain do part of the work. She had a sword she had taken from the palace armory that she had not used in 6 years, and whose weight was familiar in the way that old skills are familiar. Not comfortable, but present. The body remembering what the mind has partially set aside. She used it when she needed to. She thought about nothing except the next 2 seconds, and the 2 after that, which was how you survived close quarters when the numbers were against you. Not the battle, not the outcome, just the immediate problem in front of you and the one behind it. Time did something strange. It compressed and then stretched, and she lost track of the sequence of it. She was aware of the guards around her, who was holding, who was tiring, where the pressure was sharpest. She shifted twice, moving weight to the sections that needed it, calling names when she had the breath to call them, because names in a fight mattered, because a man who hears his name from someone who has been watching the line knows that someone is tracking whether he lives, and that knowledge does something to the quality of his effort. She had learned that years ago. She had learned it in small rooms where different kinds of battles were fought, and it had transferred. At some point in the middle of it, she took a hit to the left side. Not a blade, an impact, something blunt and fast that cracked against her ribs and made breathing suddenly expensive. She registered it and kept moving because stopping was not an available option, and pain in a functioning body was information, not instruction. She counted the minutes in her head. She had said 40. She had meant it as an estimate, not a promise. Estimates were based on variables you could read, and she had been reading variables correctly for a long time. But she had also been wrong before, and wrong here had a specific shape. 20 minutes. The line was thinning. 3 guards were down. Not dead, but out of the fight, which amounted to the same thing for the purpose of the math. The Eastern force had found the left edge of the defensive position and was probing it. She moved left. 30 minutes. Her left side had made peace with the pain the way you make peace with things you cannot change, which is to say it had become background instead of foreground. The force was still pushing, but it was pushing differently, with the quality of something that had hit resistance it had not expected to be as long-lasting as it was, and that recalibration had a cost in momentum. She felt it in the character of the pressure. They had expected the breach to be faster. So had she, honestly. And then, At the 34-minute mark, by her internal count, she heard it. The sound from the ridge road behind the eastern force. The sound of wolves moving at pace from the direction of the junction, not trying for silence. The sound of people who had been riding hard and were covering the last distance at full push because they understood that the seconds mattered. The eastern force heard it too. The pressure at the wall changed character immediately. The difference between a force pressing forward and a force that has just heard something behind it and is performing the rapid tactical calculation of what that sound means for its position. It meant Ronan. He came in from the junction road with Aldous' second unit, and he came in at the kind of pace that a man who has been wounded and has been riding anyway achieves when the alternative is unacceptable. She could see him from the wall, the distinctive size of him, the way he moved even through obvious pain, the unit spreading behind him in a flanking approach that closed off the Eastern Force's retreat option with the clean logic of a trap. The Eastern Force made the calculation that forces in their position make. They broke, not all at once, but the edge of it frayed, and when the edge frays, the center follows, and within 3 minutes of Ronan's arrival, the push at the wall had become a rout, and the rout was heading back toward the ridge road with Aldous' second unit pursuing and containing. Vesper stood at the wall. She breathed. The left side reported in with a specific vocabulary of complaint that she acknowledged and set aside. Around her, the palace guards were in various states of exhaustion and relief. Some sitting, some leaning against the wall. One of the youngest ones, the 18-year-old who had asked how many were coming, sitting with his back against the stone and his hands shaking in his lap with the particular tremor of adrenaline, leaving a body that hadn't known it was carrying that much of it. She sat down next to him. He looked at her. "You held," she said. He looked at his hands. "I didn't think I would." "Most people don't," she said. "Right up until they do." He absorbed that. The shaking in his hand slowed gradually. Ronan reached the wall. He was bleeding from somewhere on his right arm, bandaged roughly with a strip of what had been his coat, and he was moving with the careful deliberateness of a man managing pain through will rather than comfort. He looked at the wall, at the guards, at the 3 who were down and being tended. He looked at Vesper. She stood up when he got close. He stopped in front of her and he looked at her left side where the impact had hit, and she watched him register it with a tightening around his eyes. "You're hurt," he said. "Ribs," she said. "Not broken, probably." His jaw tightened. "You held the wall." "We held the wall," she said, and she meant the 43, not the 2 of them. He looked at the guards. He looked at them with the full attention of a man who was seeing something he had been previously incapable of seeing, the actual people his authority had always been made of. The young ones and the old ones, and the one sitting against the wall with shaking hands, who had held a gap against 3 times their number because someone had asked them to and told them their name while they did it. "Drennan broke the central push," he said. "Aldous held long enough. It's over." She nodded. She had already read it from the character of the sounds. "Celine's remaining contact on the council," Ronan said. "Thane has them both." "Good," she said. They stood there in the early morning light with the wall behind them and the empty ridge road in front, and the sounds of the capital beginning to understand that something had happened and had ended, and that they were on the functional side of it. Ronan looked at her for a long moment. The expression on his face was something she had not seen there before. Not the performed confidence or the managed authority or the comfortable certainty of a man who has always had the territory around him arranged to reflect his own primacy back at him. Something more exposed than that. Something that had been stripped down to the actual face beneath all the performance. "I owe you more than I can," he started. "Don't," she said. "Not here. Not like that." He stopped. He looked at her. He nodded once. "All right," he said. 3 days later, Ronan called the full council. He called it in the main hall, not the council chamber, which meant it was public, open to the court, to the senior pack representatives who had been summoned in the aftermath, to everyone who held position within the kingdom's structure. Vesper was not there in any official capacity. She was standing in the east gallery above the hall, next to Thane, because Thane had asked her to be present, and she had no specific reason to refuse. She watched Ronan stand at the head of the hall, and she watched him do the things she had told him he would have to do. He did it without script, without the diplomatic language that softened things into shapes that were easier to absorb. He said the words directly, that he had been deceived, and that the deception had been possible because of specific choices he had made and specific things he had stopped seeing. He named those things. Not vaguely, not in the abstract language of a man acknowledging general fault while protecting specific dignity. He named them. He said that the Northern Alliance structure had been built primarily through the work of his Luna, and that he had allowed that work to become invisible, and that the invisibility had been convenient for him and catastrophic for the kingdom. He said that Vesper Ashcroft had returned when the kingdom needed her, under no obligation to do so, and that the debt the kingdom owed her was not one that a title or a formal acknowledgement could repay. He said that the Luna position would remain vacant, not because it was being restructured, because the woman who should have held it had chosen differently, and that choice was hers to make. The hall was very quiet. Vesper stood in the East Gallery, and she felt the words land in her chest, and she held them there for a moment, the specific weight of public acknowledgement from a man who had spent years doing the opposite. She had not known she was waiting for it. She had believed she was past needing it. She found that both things were true simultaneously, which was the way most complicated human experiences worked. You could be past needing something and still feel its arrival as a release of something you hadn't known you were holding. She breathed once, carefully, because the ribs were still negotiating. Thane beside her looked straight ahead, but she noticed that his hands, clasped in front of him, had relaxed. Below, Ronan finished. He did not look up at the gallery. He did not make it about her witnessing it. That was the right call. The confession was for the hall and for the record, not for her consumption. She had told him how to do this correctly, in the war room, 3 days ago. He had done it correctly. She left the capital the following morning. Mara came to see her off, not at the main gate, at the West Wall supply entrance, the same one she had walked through months ago with a single bag and a traveling coat. This time she had 2 bags, because Cora had sent some things up with the Ashenvale riders, who had come to the capital to assist with the aftermath logistics, and she had allowed herself to receive them. Mara stood at the gate with the expression of someone who had decided not to cry about something and was managing it through the effort of standing very straight. "You could stay," Mara said. "You know that." "I know that," Vesper said. "It would be different now." Vesper looked at her. Mara was 23 and had survived 2 purges and moved like she was always half expecting to be invisible. And in the past weeks she had organized the palace's emergency response coordination with a quiet efficiency that had kept 3 separate crises from becoming 4. She was wasted on the role she had been given. "The new court administrator position," Vesper said. "The one Thane is setting up to replace the corrupted council structure." Mara blinked. "I heard about it." "Apply for it," Vesper said. "I already spoke to Thane. He knows your name." Mara's expression moved through several things at once. "You apply," Vesper said simply. She picked up her bags. "Take care of yourself first. That's not a small thing." She walked through the gate. The road was the same road it had always been. Pale stone and dust and the smell of early morning, the capital behind her and Ashenvale ahead. Her ribs had settled into a manageable protest at anything above a moderate pace, which meant the ride would be slower than usual. She found she did not mind. The formal dissolution of the charges against Celine Duskmore was never going to happen. The documentation was too complete, the conspiracy too documented, the evidence Thane had pulled from the relay archives too specific to be argued around. She and 2 of the confirmed council members were tried by the full pack council in the 3rd week, with representatives from the Northern Alliances present as witness, and the outcome was exile, permanent, documented, with the Duskmore secondary estate absorbed into the Crown's territory as partial reparation for the damage done. Vesper was not present for the trial. She was in Ashenvale, finishing the irrigation mapping. Cora brought her the news when the verdict was delivered, reading from a relay message with the same expression she used for weather reports. Factual, unembellished. "Exile," Vesper said. "Permanent," Cora confirmed. Both secondary family branches included in the restriction. Vesper looked at the map in front of her. The water rights dispute had been resolved the previous week, a compromise that neither party had been entirely happy with, which she had long ago decided was the clearest signal that a compromise was actually fair. The irrigation channel was going in next month. The covered market was finished. "All right," she said. Cora watched her. "That's all." "That's all," Vesper said. "It's done. What's next?" What was next was the Eastern Village annexation request. 3 small settlements that had been operating independently since the last border redefinition and wanted formal inclusion in Ashenvale's administrative territory, which would require negotiation with the capital on boundary status and resource allocation, which would require Vesper to write letters to Thane that she did not particularly want to write, but would, because the villages needed the formal protection, and that mattered more than her preference for keeping the capital at arm's length. She wrote the letters. Thane answered within the week. His answers were practical and thorough, and did not mention anything except the administrative matter at hand, which was exactly what she had wanted from them. At the bottom of the 3rd letter, below his formal signature, he had added a single line in the block lettering he used for personal notes. "The young guard from the northwest wall, Corin. He has asked about a posting to Ashenvale's border detail. With your permission," she wrote back, "send him." Ronan came to Ashenvale once more. It was in the late autumn, months after everything, after the trial and the exile, after the Northern Alliances had been formally restabilized with the revised documentation, after the first harvest reports from the eastern villages had come in and the numbers had been better than the most optimistic estimate. He came alone, no guards, no aides, the way a private person travels rather than the way a king does. She was in the village square when he arrived. The covered market was busy in the way markets are busy in late autumn. The particular compressed energy of a community preparing for winter with enough to prepare with, which is a very different quality of activity than the scarcity-driven kind. He stood at the edge of the square, and he looked at it for a moment before he saw her. When he saw her, he walked over. He did not have the tightness in his movement that he'd had in the war room, or the careful control of the capital visit. He walked like a man who had been doing something difficult for a long, sustained period and had found a way to carry it that was not precisely comfortable, but was sustainable. He looked older, not in the way of decline, but in the way of cost, the specific aging that happens when a person has stopped performing and has started actually living in the truth of their situation. "You look well," he said. "I am well," she said. He looked at the market. At the buildings that had been repaired, the ones still in process, the street that had been impassable 6 months ago and was now full of people. He looked at it with the expression of someone reading a language they had only recently learned to read. "Thane tells me the 3 eastern villages are formally Ashenvale territory now," he said, "as of last month. And the water channel goes in next spring." She looked at him. "How is the kingdom?" He was quiet for a moment. The question was genuine. She wanted to know because she had built the framework, and it mattered to her how the framework was holding, regardless of who was governing inside it. "Harder than I understood," he said, "which I should have understood from watching you do it." He looked at the ground briefly and then back at her. "I'm learning. Slowly. Thane has kept me honest." "He's good at that," she said. A pause settled between them. Not uncomfortable. The kind of silence that exists between people who have been through something real together and have arrived on the other side of it at separate destinations, and are capable of standing in the same space without requiring the silence to be filled. "I wanted to say something," Ronan said. "Not the council hall version. That was for the record." He paused. "This is for you." She waited. He looked at her with the stripped-down expression she had seen at the northwest wall. The face under the performance. "I took what you did and made it invisible because it was convenient for me for it to be invisible," he said. "And I told myself a story about why it was fine, and the story got easier to tell the longer I told it. And I know that I cannot undo any of that." He breathed. "I'm not asking you to come back. I'm not asking for anything. I just needed you to hear it from me directly, without an audience, without any of it being for the record." She listened to all of it. She let it sit for a moment after he finished. "I hear it," she said. "That's all I needed," he said. She looked at him. At the man who had been the reason she had spent 7 years being invisible, who had stood in a war room and asked her what to do with the stripped-down honesty of someone who had finally run out of alternatives to truth, who had held a junction road wounded and mobile because the seconds mattered, and he understood now why they mattered. People were not simple. That was the thing she had been learning and relearning her entire life, and it never got easier to hold. The capacity for someone to be both the cause of your harm and the person who arrives eventually at something genuine. Both things true. Neither thing erasing the other. "You're going to be all right," she said. "Not the way you were before. Better than that, if you keep going the way you're going." He looked at her. Something moved in his face, not hope exactly, something more durable than hope. "And you," he said. She looked at the market, at the woman arranging winter squash on a table who had asked for help with a land dispute 3 months ago and had gotten it. At Corin, the young guard from the northwest wall, crossing the far end of the square in his new Ashenvale border detail uniform, stopping to talk to one of the village children with the easy quality of someone who had found a place that fit. At all of it. At the particular quality of a thing that was hers. Not by title, not by marriage, not by any authority, except the authority of having shown up and worked and kept showing up. "I'm already all right," she said. He looked at what she was looking at. He understood, she thought, more of it than she expected him to. He stayed for the afternoon. He ate with the village elders. Cora placed him firmly at the end of the table and treated him with the specific courtesy she reserved for visitors who had not yet demonstrated usefulness, which Vesper found quietly satisfying. He listened more than he spoke. He helped carry a load of timber from the delivery cart to the building site at the north end of the village, because someone asked him to, and he did not explain that he was a king. He left before evening. He stopped at the edge of the square, and he looked back at her once. Just once, the way you look back at something you are closing the chapter on rather than reopening it. She met his eyes across the distance of the square. She nodded. He turned and walked to his horse and rode north, back toward the capital and the kingdom and the long, slow, difficult work of becoming the ruler he should have been from the beginning. She watched him go. Then she turned back to the market and the work and the particular quality of her own life, the one she had built in this place for these people, from the raw material of a choice that had felt like loss, and had turned out to be the beginning of everything that actually belonged to her. Cora appeared at her elbow. She had a winter planning document and the expression of a woman with no interest in sentiment when there was work on the table. "The Eastern Granary estimates came in," Cora said. "You're going to want to look at the numbers." "Show me," Vesper said. She took the document. She read the numbers. They were good numbers. Better than good. The kind of numbers that meant the people here were going to be warm and fed through the winter without the margin of error tension that had defined the last several years. She noted them in her ledger. She looked at what was next. There was always something next. That had once felt like a burden. The perpetual demand of the work, the endless forward motion of problems that needed solving, and people that needed helping, and things that needed building. She had carried it for years as weight, the cost of being the person who showed up, who kept the framework running, who asked nothing and received nothing and kept going anyway. It did not feel like weight now. It felt like what a life actually was when it was yours. Not decorated with a crown or defined by someone else's acknowledgement or measured against the scale of a kingdom's politics. Just the forward motion of waking up and doing the thing that was yours to do, in the place you had chosen, among people who had asked for you and found you worth asking for. Vesper Ashcroft had not lost herself in the leaving. She had been waiting for herself at the destination. And now she was here, and the granary numbers were good, and Corin was learning the border routes, and the water channel was going in next spring, and there was a covered market in a square that had been empty when she arrived, and none of it was visible from the capital or recorded in any chronicle of the kingdom's history. It was only visible from inside it, which was, she had finally understood, exactly enough.